Wow, that was fabulous. Yannick Nézet-Séguin with part of Swan Lake with the Fabulous Philadelphians. So it's wonderful to welcome you all today to another edition of Live with Carnegie Hall. And my two guests are two personal friends as well as great friends of Carnegie Hall. Yannick Nézet-Séguin, the music director of the Philadelphia Orchestra, and Matthias Tarnopolsky, the president and CEO of the orchestra. So, in terms of the orchestra's relationship with Carnegie Hall, well, they've played here nearly 800 times since they performed here first in 1902. And in that period, they've played every single year. This is the most of any orchestra in the world, except, of course, the New York Philharmonic, which was resident here until the early 60s. But then, of course, without doubt, at some point, the Philadelphians will have played more times and will continue to play more into the future. So to begin with, we were each going to speak a little bit about some of the key historic moments in the Philadelphia Orchestra Carnegie Hall relationship. And Yannick, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about Leopold Stakhovski, who in fact began his music directorship of the orchestra in 1912, finishing in 1938. So, in fact, just before World War I till just before World War II. And you started in 2012, exactly 100 years after he started. So I worked with him, in fact, funnily enough, when I was at the London Symphony Orchestra. I was in the cello section with him. And I do remember, I mean, he was an extraordinary character. I mean, I think probably people couldn't make music like that. Now, when one thinks of some of the transcriptions of Bach, the totally free bowing, where, you know, which created this incredible lush sound, which so attracted Disney. Tell me a little bit about your feelings about Tchaikovsky and what he created at the orchestra.
It's, Clive, absolutely unprecedented, I think. And there's no real example in history where an orchestra was able to work with so few music directors during so many years. And the fact that I'm only the number 8 of all the music directors in the history, starting 100 years after number 3, who was Stokowski, just tells you how the continuity, and that's why we can recognize the sound of the orchestra today. And it hasn't changed so much since the Stokowski days. And I was very interested when I started to look into the history of my orchestra and my illustrious predecessors, and especially their relationship with Carnegie Hall, to see that this sense of history, but also that what we call today tradition, is also made of groundbreaking elements, technological settings. You know, Stokowski loved to have the shell painted different colors in Philadelphia. He didn't do this at Carnegie Hall, but he would paint the shell differently to have a full concert experience, the way we use lighting today. This famous Fantasia using new technology, recordings, all of this is a real tradition made of world premieres, and especially his championing a lot of the great composers of the early 20th century and having a lot of world premieres with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and some of them also at Carnegie Hall. So that is very impressive as a legacy.
Fantastic. Now, the two of you were going to talk a little bit about Eugene Ormandy, as well as Rachmaninoff as composer and performer.
Maybe one of the most famous composers of the 20th century, Sergei Rachmaninoff, who had this deep friendship and connection with Ormandy, with the Philadelphia Orchestra and Carnegie Hall. Reflect, if you will, on this famous cycle of concerts that they did together in the 30s.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the great partnerships of, I believe, history of music, and especially the 20th century history of music. Rachmaninoff, already famous as a pianist, exiled in America, very famous as a pianist there, keeping composing, meeting Ormandy, meeting the Philadelphia Orchestra, falling in love with the sound of the orchestra, and then writing from that moment every orchestral piece with the sound of the Philadelphia Orchestra in mind. And this actually came to fruition at Carnegie Hall, where in 1939 there was a cycle of concerts where Rachmaninoff was at the piano, Ormandy conducted the Philadelphia Orchestra, and there was a vast selection of his works for piano and orchestra performed. This is another example where all of these elements were so important in shaping, I would say, the American music scene history.
I imagine being at that series of concerts, the great composer, pianist Rachmaninoff, this great orchestra, this great conductor whose, destinies and histories are inextricably linked, and, world premiere of the Symphonic Dances, one of his most famous work, led by Ormandy in 1941. And of course, the end of Ormandy's career and life are united on the stage of Carnegie Hall.
Yeah, this is a moment where, this is one of those moments I wish I would have been there. In 1984, Ormandy, after all these years being the music director of the Philadelphia Orchestra, he had left a couple of years before, left it to Riccardo Muti, who still to this day has a very strong relationship with Carnegie Hall too. And his very final performance as then an honorary conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra was in the final concert of his life, was at Carnegie Hall with Beethoven Pastoral Symphony. And Ormandy was a very proud man and always conducted from memory the Pastoral Symphony, Beethoven. But he was ill, we could see, and the musicians were concerned. So at the intermission, someone decided it might have been a good idea to put a music stand there and put the score of Bartók Concerto for Orchestra, which, of course, him being of Hungarian origin, was a work very close to his heart. And so he, very frail, came back to the podium, saw the score in front of him, and just slammed it closed down. It's one of so to the very last moments of him as a conductor showed his very fiery temperament and character.
He sounds amazing, and you walk into any rehearsal or concert of the orchestra, and Stakhovsky, Rachmaninoff, Ormandy, they're alive and well. It's the most amazing thing. Clive, we could have a program each on Stakhovsky and Ormandy, and Yannick's views on both. Yannick, I'll give you the closing comments here, and then you can hand back to Clive.
Well, I think that I like very much what Clive said, that, with continuing our history and our partnership between our institutions, we're going to clearly be the orchestra the most present ever on this stage, and I can't wait to go back on that stage. We can't wait. But right. Clive, there's someone you want to introduce us who is actually a very important person, part of the history of Carnegie Hall also today.
Yes, well, thank you both, firstly, for that terrific conversation around Ormandy and Rachmaninoff. Yes, well, when Carnegie Hall opened in 1891, until the early 60s, when the Philharmonic moved to Lincoln Center, it was basically a rental hall. So there was no curation, there was no nothing. And so the unbelievable history is purely because the building was a magnet for the greatest artists in the world. They all had to be there, but nobody was curating it. Nobody was running. There was no artistic direction, nothing. So it's only really since the late 60s, Carnegie Hall has begun to develop its own artistic identity. Now, come the early 60s, when it did become owned by the city and had its own board and began its own artistic direction, up to that point, there was no archive whatsoever. There were no records of anything. Nobody kept archives. And so somebody called Gino Francesconi, shortly after that, who had wanted to be a conductor, there was various things he'd wanted to do, but he felt this was his mission in life. And Gino has created the most extraordinary archive. He spends all his life on the auction sites, buying everything he can find. And it's now a great archive, but from zero, literally for the first 70 years, it had to grow from zero to what it is today. So he's also got a wonderful collection of things around the Philadelphia Orchestra. So we wanted to show you a video of Gino.
Hello, my name is Gino Francesconi. I'm the director of the Archives and the Rose Museum at Carnegie Hall. And today we're going to talk about the Philadelphia Orchestra, which is a real honor. It's one of the great orchestras in the world. It was founded in the year 1900 by the conductor Fritz Schiele. And by 1902, they had already come to Carnegie Hall to do their first performance. And the review in the New York Times started off by saying they were an orchestra of uncommon excellence. And they've been doing that ever since. And they've performed at Carnegie Hall almost 800 times. And what's unique about this orchestra is that in their 112 years, for 68 of those years, they only had 2 conductors. This is extraordinary. The first one was Leopold Stakhovski. Now, Leopold Stakhovski and the Philadelphia Orchestra sort of meant for each other. And we have a wonderful shot here where he's autographed to Carnegie Hall, and it's a perfect pose. He was continuously experimenting, and he almost single-handedly he developed something called the Philadelphia sound. Well, he did something called free bowing, which meant he told the string players, bow how you feel. And so what did this do? It created this lush sound, so that when Walt Disney was looking for a conductor and an orchestra to perform in his movie Fantasia, it seemed like the Philadelphia Orchestra and Stokowski were perfect for it, and they were. When Stokowski left the orchestra, another conductor by the name of Eugene Ormandy arrived, and he stayed with the orchestra for 44 years, unprecedented. And in our archives, one of our treasures is one of his batons, actually. I think it's the last baton he ever used here at Carnegie Hall. So it's a remarkable stretch of flawless performance. And they've had a very long relationship with Carnegie Hall, coming here every year since 1902. When the city of New York purchased Carnegie Hall in 1960, the Carnegie Hall Corporation was founded, and it was at that point that the hall itself began producing concerts. The very first concert that Carnegie Hall produced was a tribute to Jack Benny, as thanks for all the work that Jack Benny did to try to help save Carnegie Hall from demolition. And it was with an all-star cast: Benny Goodman, Van Cliburn, Roberta Peters. And who was the orchestra backing them up? Eugene Ormandy and the Philadelphia Orchestra. Then, when Carnegie Hall began producing its own events on a regular basis, the very first subscription concerts were with Eugene Ormandy and the Philadelphia Orchestra. And in 1980, when Eugene Ormandy retired, Riccardo Muti became their next music director. In our archives, we also have one of Riccardo Muti's batons, which is a real treasure, because the combination of Muti and the Philadelphia Orchestra, he continued the line that Tchaikovsky started. And one of my favorite items in the archives is this flyer, and it's the Philadelphia Orchestra with Rachmaninoff. Rachmaninoff is taken on mythical proportions these days. He's identified only by one name now, Rachmaninoff. And the first time he appeared with them, he was taken with the sound, and anything he composed for orchestra after his first appearance with Philadelphia, it was that orchestra he kept in mind. To hear the Philadelphia Orchestra in Carnegie Hall performing works that are in their blood is a remarkable experience.
So Yannick, that was a very big picture view of the history of the Philadelphia Orchestra at Carnegie Hall from Gino. Now, you've already become a very, very big part of our life and our history, but I hope much more so that you become an even bigger part in the future. And I mean, we've got so many exciting plans that we're looking at for the future as well. You made your Carnegie Hall debut and your debut as music director of the Philadelphia Orchestra in 2012. Just tell me a little bit about how that felt, but then I'd love to go on to why you actually accepted the job. I mean, it seems very obvious to me, but I'd just love to know what the process was for you.
So obviously, Clive, that was a very, very important week in my life to start my tenure as music director, choosing the Verdi Requiem for many reasons, because interestingly, I conducted that piece since I was very young. I think my first time conducting it, I was 24. And when I became the music director of the Orchestre Métropolitain in Montreal, my inaugural concert was a tour around Montreal, actually, of this Verdi Requiem. And probably already, as you know, coming into, you know, so many things of my own history, my connection with church music, my connection with opera, and my connection with quintessential symphonic music came together in the Verdi Requiem. So that's what we chose to open in Philadelphia this tenure, and as my debut at Carnegie Hall. So I had been dreaming of playing Carnegie Hall all my life, and I could do so with such an iconic piece, with a lot of people on stage, and could feel the anticipation from the audience. So this is a moment I will never forget. And you know, you're asking why I chose to say yes to that job. It's interesting because we focus a lot on sometimes conductors choosing an orchestra or an orchestra choosing a conductor, and it's actually a little bit like a marriage. You know, I use this analogy a lot, but there's not only one person choosing the other. Huh? It's something that you feel as a chemistry which goes both ways. And this orchestra, right from the very beginning of when I started rehearsing with them, gave me what I imagined and more, with the simplest of gestures from myself. It felt like if I wanted to push a little bit faster or slower or more intense or more tender, they could do it all with a smile, with a generosity. And I felt that on a human level, we could go somewhere so much. And yeah, that's I fell in love right away, and apparently it sort of was reciprocated.
So Yannick, we've got a wonderful recording of the Verdi Requiem, which is where your journey with the orchestra and Carnegie Hall started. So I'd love you just to introduce that, please.
This is the very beginning of the Verdi Requiem. Unfortunately, not recorded at Carnegie Hall, but nevertheless in our beautiful hall in Philadelphia, Verizon Hall, at the Kimmel Center. And we can feel the anticipation of everyone trying to show and convince the world of this new partnership. So the very tender beginning with the Westminster Symphonic Choir and a great quartet of soloists in the Kyrie. And we're going to also go into the very beginning of the Dies Irae, because what's the Verdi Requiem without those big bass drum strokes of the Dies Irae?
Yeah, absolutely. Mind you, it doesn't feel a very religious piece, does it? It's one of the most incredible concert pieces.
It's a sincere piece. This is what I think. You know, Verdi was just using what he knew to express his true feelings about life after death.
Matthias, welcome back. And I'd love you to talk just a little bit about innovation at the Philadelphia Orchestra. You've been very much at the forefront of a lot of innovation throughout the 20th century. And I'm talking more about technological innovation. Just talk to us a little bit about some of the things that you feel have been the key developments for the orchestra.
Thank you, Clive. And you're absolutely right. I mean, when we were reflecting earlier on Stokowski and Ormandy, we were talking about firsts, be they in new music and touring, but also in recording technology, going right back to Stokowski in 1917, making experimental recordings with Victor Records, the collaborations later in the century and with Bell Labs, the recording of the feature film, of course, of Fantasia, the first symphonic LP of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, right up to, more recent times, being the first US orchestra to offer downloads through its own online store, to our virtual program notes on your phone, Live Notes, which just started in 2014. So there's a sense of innovation that is one of the orchestra's core values. We talk about the Philadelphia way. Well, in the Philadelphia way, innovation is front and center.
And are your recordings with Ormandy, with Tchaikovsky, I mean, even ones that go back that far, do people still listen to them?
They do. And we have fans and collectors around the world, and we're working hard to make them as available as we can on a regular basis. Yeah, the recorded legacy of the Philadelphia Orchestra is remarkable, and capturing, the sound and the essence of two of the greats of the 20th century, Leopold Stakhovski and Eugene Ormandy, who were also at the forefront of recordings, is one of the great gifts to music and culture that the orchestra has provided.
One thing we just wanted to show you, because it also did involve the Philadelphia Orchestra and was a very innovative project, is a Google project that we did, which was really a 360 look at the orchestra. So please enjoy. Yannick, welcome back again. And I just wanted to talk a little bit. I mean, obviously, we all love the partnership with you and the Philadelphia Orchestra and Carnegie Hall. And we've explored so many things. And one thing I did promise you on your previous program was that we will definitely find a place for the Beethoven cycle in the future that was lost because of COVID-19. I just wondered if you would talk a little bit about what for you are the key artistic pillars that you want to build in your relationship with the Hall.
One of the fantastic aspects of Carnegie Hall is also the connection, a little bit like what we've been talking with the Philadelphia Orchestra, is the connection between the tradition and what people imagine, which is, being on the Perlman stage of the hall in the Isaac Stern Auditorium, but also, there's a Zankel Hall and the Violin Recital Hall, and it's all the education aspect of it. And this is why I was so happy when you asked me to be a perspectives artist, especially for 2 seasons, because even though this one is now truncated, I think the chance of showing not only my relationship with Philadelphia, but also what I do with the Chamber Orchestra of Europe, for example, and bringing my Orchestre Métropolitain this season earlier, where, I've been for 20 years, music director, and next season having the opportunity to do a choral concert, a cappella, and not with orchestra, and the opportunity also to play a piano. I think this is what I like. It's that it's a context, an institution, Carnegie Hall, where I feel I can show all that is part of who I am as a musician. And what I've always been enjoying, or not more than enjoying, I think my raison d'être as a musician is to touch on all these elements. I'm as much a chamber musician as I am an opera conductor, and I love voice as much as I love the instruments, and this I love Baroque as much as I like to be involved with new music. And of course, year after year, to be able to come and still enjoy the great repertoire where the Philadelphia Orchestra can shine, like, for example, this excerpt that we're about to hear from Richard Strauss' Alpensinfonie, which was the last performance I conducted at Carnegie Hall before this big intermission.
another area of music making and artists where you've been a real champion is of supporting young artists, of debuts for young artists. I don't know whether you want to talk a little bit first about the tradition of that at the Philadelphia Orchestra, and then perhaps come on to the things that you've done. But that also includes composers as well, I know.
Absolutely. I mean, Clive, a debut at Carnegie Hall is stuff that dreams are made of, for any young artist. So I was really taken when I became a music director of the Philadelphia Orchestra to see the number of important artists who were given their full, I would say, main subscription debut at Carnegie Hall on the main stage with the Philadelphia Orchestra. So that was always a tremendous help to their career and important moments. This dates from even 1906 with Arthur Rubinstein, who was actually given his North American debut at Carnegie Hall with the Philadelphia Orchestra. And up to closer, more recent days, people like Yu Jia Wang, like Hilary Hahn, like even more recently, Johannes Moser, Ben Beilman, and last season, Beatrice Rana. So all important artists for over a century. And I think this is a passion of mine to be able to, of course, collaborate with the great legends of our time, but also the new legends, the younger ones. And there's nothing better than having them rise to the occasion of having their debut on the Carnegie Hall stage. Same for the composers, from Nico Muhly to recently Valerie Coleman. This is a big passion of mine. We've done in recent years at Carnegie, Todd Machover, and we've done Gabby Frank, and we've done pieces by Mason Bates, and we were supposed to do more this season, but of course there will be more in the future. And of course there is this very, very, very beautiful partnership that we should talk about, Clive, this NYO2 that we did a couple of years, and which is an extension in a way of the National Youth Orchestra of USA that you founded, but it's a different kind of project, this one, because the recruiting was different. It was for also a younger age even, but it was also a partnership. It's not a normal audition process. It was a partnership with the schools and the teachers so that they could identify the people who could shine at their best from various communities, and where sometimes the resources are not at the same disposal for these tremendous talents. And the partnership between the Philadelphia Orchestra as an institution, but also the musicians from the Philadelphia Orchestra, giving mentorship and teaching to this orchestra made of communities where the classical music is not maybe as popular. And I think this is a great endeavor and another example where I feel that the partnership between your hall and our orchestra goes much more and deeper than just playing concerts together.
Well, I think the whole conversation today has really been about shared values, and and the fact that the Philadelphia Orchestra and Carnegie Hall, I think it's why the partnership is such a great one and such an enjoyable one, is because we genuinely do share values. I mean, so we've talked about many things. You're absolutely right. I mean, we do a huge amount of work with young people, and now with our education programs, we're reaching, we were, about 800,000 people a year, most of them kids. But as you said, one of the big projects we launched was National Youth Orchestra of America 6 years ago, which was for the most brilliant, finest 16 to 19-year-olds in the country. And every year they travel to different parts of the world as youth music ambassadors for their country, which is incredibly exciting for them. But after we'd been doing it for 2 or 3 years, we realized that there's a lot of kids who have the talent but haven't actually had the opportunity, whether it's access to best teaching or whatever it might be. And so we decided to create NYO2, which is for 14 to 17-year-olds, to try and find the talent and give them a chance to get onto the ladder. And what has been fascinating is well over 20 each year now of alumni from NYO2 are getting into NYO. And one of the most disturbing but inspiring things about this is that lots of them would have been good enough to apply for NYO, but assumed they would not have been good enough. It was about self-perception was the problem, not even talent or playing. So they're having a huge impact on NYO. They will ultimately transform the people coming through to music colleges in America and therefore on into orchestras. So we loved the work we did together with you and your principal players with MYO2. And we just wanted to play a video of MYO2 with Esperanza Spalding playing a piece called Apple Blossom. And this also shows that the sort of music they do is very varied as well, but they're wonderful.
Branches cradle sleeping buds yawning open, welcomed by an aging man. He greets them fondly, with memories of when her boughs were arms that held him as a younger man. Together they would marvel the birth of springtime. Now he stands beneath the apple blossoms every year where they used to go walking. Tells her about the summer and the autumn, the winter in his heart, and her apple blossom. That summer they would dream of being 3 and smile, imagining her round as the apples on the ground. That fall they loved and waited. But winter came too soon. Before her seed could bloom, she wilted from the chill, and all fell cold. As he opened the earth to receive her, he prayed heaven would be waiting to meet her. He kisses her cold cheek goodbye, but he couldn't surrender the hope they had sighed. So in her folded hands, he placed the seed from their favorite tree, and he laid her to rest neath a blanket of white till they'd meet again in the springtime. Mother of the spring, the sleeping buds she cradles slowly unopened, welcomed by an aging man. He greets them fondly. Oh, sweet apple blossoms, greets them fondly. Mother of the spring, hear it shine, they meet again. Each apple
Fantastic and wonderful to have the players from the Philadelphia Orchestra playing side by side along with these young musicians. What an extraordinary experience for them. So, Yannick, Matthias, thank you so much. You've both been fantastic. It's been wonderful having you on the program. We could easily have talked for another couple of hours, but that's for another day. But I think what would be lovely is just for each of us to speak for a minute about the future and where our dreams lie, because after all, we will come through all of this. And I mean, for me, I think one of the fascinating things about horrible experiences like this is, you know, as the saying goes, you know, never waste a disaster. And so, I mean, we've done a vast amount on developing plans for technology and in terms of how we can share music much more substantially in the future than we had in the past. So it's put a real accelerator under all of that. But I think it's also taught us a lot about storytelling and how important with programs like this, with so much of what we're doing, that we get storytelling right at the center of what we do. And so we're really looking in terms of programming in the future at how we do that, so that we really take audiences on journeys of exploration, which we've tried to do with our festivals, but where we think we could do much more of that with individual concerts as well, so that people really feel they're explorers, they're making discoveries as our partners. So, Matthias, your thoughts?
First of all, Clive, thank you. Thanks for inviting us today to be part of this program. Thank you for the decades of friendship and for the over a century of connection between Carnegie Hall and the Philadelphia Orchestra. In the middle of all this, Yannick and I and the Philadelphia Orchestra launched our next season, which is entitled Our World Now, which is an exploration of how, through the programs and the music of the Philadelphia Orchestra and Yannick and others, we show how we as human beings, as humanity, we engage with the world in the context of women artists, in the context of technology, and in the context of the environment. We didn't know how prescient these thoughts could be, because what we want is for people to be changed by the programs, to change the way we approach our world. And, you know, as sure, I don't know if you can hear them, but outside this, our guest room window, the birds are singing, and as sure as the birds will continue to sing, we will be back on the stage of Carnegie Hall, of Verizon Hall in Philadelphia, of the schools in Philadelphia that are part of our everyday. And with those same shared values that you described that connect our organizations deeply, we will connect again in person, in addition to continually doing so digitally during this phase. We will connect again in person with all the people who love music, love the Philadelphia Orchestra, at home, in the region and around the world.
Gentlemen, it's beautiful to hear you talk, and I share all the values, and you said it, Clive, earlier, it's shared values between our institutions, and I think hearing you talk this way also show how we do share the values together and how we're kindred spirits. My final word would be, of course, of gratitude to Carnegie Hall to stay engaged with the audiences this way and allowing me to keep staying engaged with the beautiful audiences everywhere of Carnegie and also everywhere in the world. But what I'm reflecting on at the moment is how privileged we are, musicians, to be able to always think about mastering time and space. Especially time in music is so important. We spend our days talking about tempo, talking about structure and how we can deal with a short form, a long form, a symphony from Bruckner, or a quick movement from any suite. And that gives us a perspective on the crisis at the moment. And in big pieces like the Verdi Requiem, which we heard a few excerpts from earlier, there's always this sense of how time also helps getting through hardships and having some hope. And in even a piece like a Requiem, which is a pretty somber and dark piece, there's the hope. And this is what I want us to hear to end this afternoon together, an excerpt from the Sanctus, the most hopeful and joyful piece of this Verdi Requiem.